I really think we had a chance to really warmly welcome and hear, I think, from two of the most perceptive observers of the human condition and of the media, Ken Burns and Brooke Gladstone. Please join the very
I'm on. Can you hear me? Okay?
Yes.
All right. Something, we had a brief discussion last week, and there was something that really stuck with me. You said right off the bat about what you do. You said, for a living, I wake the dead. And as you go through these historical, iconic is the perfect word to describe them, documentaries that you have done through the years, you really do bring them to life. But as was mentioned, that there's so many funders involved with this particular enterprise, I think it's because the dead and the living are conjoined, because many people are in a position of knowing that they are at risk. I spoke to somebody in the cancer hour we did last week who said a word that many people prefer is previvor, if they have the BRCA genetic mutation. Tell me about the circumstances under which you took on this project, because I know you're in the midst of another enormous project, actually a couple of other enormous projects.
Several films, and this has a really very clear but very complicated genesis. The Pulitzer Prize winning nonfiction book of 4 years ago, 2011, was Siddhartha Mukherjee's amazing The Emperor of All Maladies. He finished it, it was published in 2010, and Sharon Rockefeller, who runs the PBS station I've had the great pleasure of working with for the last 32 years, was herself surviving an extraordinarily long, painful and difficult bout with cancer, read this book in recovery, and said, you have to do this. And I said, you know more than anyone else how busy I am, and we have things going on then on the Roosevelts, and a small film about the Gettysburg Address on Jackie Robinson, which is next, a massive 18-hour film on the history of the war in Vietnam, which will upend any preconceptions you might have. Big history of country music, a biography of Ernest Hemingway. They're all underway. They're all underway. These are not just plotted things. We tend to plan, because of the difficulty of funding, which you referenced, 10 years in advance. But I read the book, and I could not do it. I'm here trying to wake the dead with you this morning because my mother died of cancer when I was 11 years old, and I think all that I've become is in some ways some complicated reaction to that.
And pause for a moment here, because she didn't, she died of cancer when you were 11, but she also took a while. It wasn't just a sudden wave. You lived with it.
I lived with it for 10 years, and my very first consciousness is knowing that something was not just wrong, but terribly wrong with the most important person in my life. And of course, as I was 3 and 4 and 5 and began to learn what it was, and then 6 and 7 and 8, and got to understand the full terror of it, I didn't have a childhood, but I knew right afterwards I watched my father, who had never cried during all of this, cry at a movie. And I understood instantaneously the power of film. Now, we tend to think about emotions, yes, it was called Odd Man Out by Sir Carol Reed about the Irish Troopers. James Mason, my father just let go. I was 12 years old, it was 6 months after my mother died, and I just said, I want to be a filmmaker. And I think we mistakenly think that emotion is sentimentality and nostalgia. And quite often it is, and that's the enemy of good anything. But we also then tend to retreat to a kind of rational world where 1 and 1 equals 2 all the time, safely there from higher emotions that actually are what our lives are about, the relationships we care about, the love, the sex, the faith, the art, whatever it compels us, that peculiar calculus where 1 and 1 equals 3. And that's what I became interested in. Have tried to do that in all my work, to have a relationship with the past that isn't just sort of at arm's length, safely dead, but to try to wake that dead, to have a conversation with my mother. And it's not, I had to do this, and be involved in it, and I had to find someone to work on the day-to-day, but to honor what Sid had done, to sort of talk about this extraordinary, if it is the Emperor of All Maladies, then we are the subjects of this tyrant, and we ought to be in the resistance movement. And that takes various forms, and what we try to do is do that. We have a lot of funders, but Sid and I very early on decided to do what a cancer doctor would do, is that we did not learn until the film was live who those funders were. With the exception of the non-pharma ones we knew, but if it had anything to do, we didn't want to know, because we didn't want in any way to influence the content of our film either, so that people might say, well, you know, Genentech is an underwriter, and you talk about the development of Herceptin, which is a hugely important story in the history of cancer research, which was last night's episode, kind of its sort of, I thought, stunning kind of climax of it, and Gleevec, which is Novartis, but Genentech turned out, we found out after we finished the film, was one of the funders. But we kept that kind of scientific line to that thing. But it's always a complicated process. We have folks from WETA, the presenting station, and our tin cup is out all the time just to be able to tell these stories. So it's good to have a moment where you can coordinate and think about how you go forward with this.
I was thinking about what you said about emotion, and it's one of the ways, the world is too big for us to break down and analyze. I guess it's one of the ways we organize our material and try to understand the world. And so if you can inform that, then you've really won. I guess, what's that word, a heuristic? It's sort of a mental shortcut. Your emotional response is that, but if it isn't smart, then it can lead to terrible things. And I think that that's something you wield in all of your documentaries. Now, in this case, again, you found someone to direct it, and I know that you were very involved in the project. The voice, it's a very technical subject sometimes, although incredibly accessible, the way that you create it and the way that you present it. But the range of voices, in the initial stages, it's a lot of doctors who risked an enormous amount to buck the tide, and then later you give the voice many times to patients themselves, and I think that that's probably the next phase in discussing cancer, is creating a lexicon that makes sense to the people who have cancer, or who are around people who have cancer, a way to discuss it, because right now it's filtered through a fairly narrow technical lens.
So maybe Robert Gazelle on NBC tells you about some important thing, and you sort of struggle to grasp the cancer, to open your mind to that thing, but then you're on to the next thing of that report, and then maybe 6 months later something else happens. We don't have any organizing principle, which is of course what storytelling and art and that emotional communication. Tolstoy said, art is the communication of emotion from one person to another, and he meant those higher emotions, not the baser, sentimental and nostalgic ones. And so for us, this was a time we deserved, just as the scientific community is emerging from its individual silos of specific studies of specific cancers. I'm in breast cancer, oh, I'm in pancreatic cancer, I'm doing prostate cancer, I'm in leukemia, whatever it is, and they're not really talking to one another, just as they're now beginning to raise up and finding and trying to find that kind of unified theory of everything. So too, we're demanding an understanding, a kind of executive summary. Where have we been? That's the history. Where are we now? That's the sort of combination with that history of complex science that can be communicated to an audience without dumbing it down too much, but with also making it familiar to people so they get it. You're in on the discovery.
Well, that's the power of narrative, right? You tell a story.
And you tell a story and you get people involved in this great, probably the most important detective story on Earth, which is this one, about cancer. And then you say, where are we going? And that's sort of the purpose of an executive summary. And in this case, we wanted to, I thought Sid's book was a work of literature. We wanted to bring kind of cinematic equivalent that would try to mix history with complex science and also have as the glue that might hold this sort of intertwined double helix together, the emotions of human stories that punctuate this. So it's one thing to know, say, for example, the heroism of the Sidney Farber, who in a circumstance of childhood leukemia, which is 100% fatal when our story opens on him, he has this incredibly counter-indicated, for obvious reasons, idea that he will poison these kids, right? Now, he does this, there's some modest, very modest success, but now, you know, childhood leukemia is 90% curable, and a lot of it, all of it, flows out of his willingness to go against it. But by the time they're doing combination chemotherapies, he thinks that's too much, and he becomes the old orthodoxy that's resisting the new thing. And so what you have is this incredible story that moves from ancient times, from the Egyptians forward in fits and starts, a few steps forward, a couple backwards, you know, always going forward. But as you say, just to square the circle here, what's so interesting is that the 1970s also saw the beginning of patients having agency in this discussion, particularly women, with regard to, first, the radical mastectomy practiced without a thought for almost a century that
Rose Kushner.
Halstead had insisted, and said the data's not there, you know, and she was supported by, you know, really great researchers saying, you know, the data's not there. There's no appreciable difference between a radical mastectomy and a lumpectomy if metastasis hasn't taken place. This becomes a story, and Rose Kushner becomes the person that embodies that agency on the part of women. And then later on, as drugs are coming from these monoclonal antibodies that are being created by Genentech and Novartis, and you want to go through a randomized trial, that's science saying, don't fool us. We always fool ourselves with false hope. We have to have the scientific proof. We have to do a randomized trial. But if you're a woman dying of breast cancer, you're not so much involved in this, and the great ethical dynamics of the demands of science on one hand and the needs of individuals who might be saved by a drug like Herceptin or Gleevec, you know, become hugely important stories within this larger cancer story. And where we're going now becomes yet another dimension to that story. Some of the things we've already escaped the specific gravity of Siddhartha Mukherjee's book into things that were only vaguely on the horizon as he finished 5 years ago, that are now on our lips every single day with regard to cancer research. And the film had to have a kind of nimbleness and fluidity to be able to embrace and expand.
It's very hard to film a moving target, isn't it?
It's that. So that's why executive summaries are only that, and why we feel history is that. We sort of tend to think of the past, any past subject. And this is so much like my Civil War film, you can't believe. The enemy is us. We have met the enemy, and he is us. That is the story of the American Civil War. That is the story of cancer. As Harold Varmus said when he accepted the Nobel Prize for discovering with Michael Bishop the oncogene, he said that cancer, this fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. We understood the most minute aspect of this mechanism, but we understood this was a distorted version of our normal cells. In order for you and me to talk right now, our cells need to be dividing. When they don't do that
And
right
moving
way and moving,
in confederation,
we have cancer. That's that. So this is the great dilemma of it. And the past is not fixed. It is malleable. And so we're constantly, always trying to sort of grab that moving target and say, well, at least for now, this is where we are.
one reason why I wanted to bring up the role of the patient. It's so hard, people don't like victim or afflicted or survivor or certainly not carrier, because one of the early theories was that it was infectious, and that created a big mess, as you can imagine. But I bring up Rose Kushner because, you know, I look around the room and I see a lot of women in the room, and the thing about Rose Kushner is she had cancer, she was a journalist, she wasn't a scientist, but she would go to these scientific meetings with doctors and she'd start screaming, show me the data, that radical mastectomy works. And of course, there wasn't any data to that effect. A lot of people had their clavicles removed for no reason at all, I know that's not mine. Oh, that's hers. Okay. Mine sounds different. It's usually mine that goes off during this talk.
I yell at people if it was mine.
But, you know, you guys are in the business, as I understand it, of handing out money. And as such, where would you direct people? Because it seems to me that informed laity are a useful place to go in this regard.
Well, let's just talk about, we are at a phenomenal moment, science-wise, in cancer research. But we also live in a republic, a very complicated republic that is sort of dialectically preoccupied with a very boring and superficial politics of red state, blue state, whatever the dialectic we can find, gay, straight, as we know in Indiana.
I so much prefer covering science.
Yeah, well, but
not that isn't politicized.
But it is now politicized because what's crept into the discussion of our republic for the last 35 years has been the notion that government is itself the enemy. And that idea has metastasized like a cancer. And so we have to begin with an almost instantaneous chemotherapy when at this particular moment, the government of the United States, which has been in history, might I say, for all of its enormous screw-ups, one of the greatest forces of good, has actually stood at a moment when it could be applying its force in this discussion about immunotherapy, about targeted treatments, about the fact that now that we've sequenced the human genome and we are able to, with advanced computing, crunch some metadata, we're really at a threshold of an incredibly hopeful moment that requires the federal government to step in. It is because of this preoccupation with this dialectic knot. And it means, because so much of the wealth in the country has moved out of government and out of even corporations and more towards individuals and foundations and things, that we're going to have to find another way to pick up the slack, or at least find a way to add our voices to a chorus of voices in that kind of patient advocacy, because 1 out of 2 men here will get cancer, and that's numbers increasing. And 1 out of 3 women will get cancer in their lifetime. And so if there was a more urgent problem, please tell me what it is, a more urgent need for that sort of focus. So I'm hoping that the film has a double thing. One is to animate and spark imagination, and maybe everyone in their own fashion joins that resistance movement. If you become a cancer researcher, that's great. If you become an oncologist, that's fantastic, treating people. If you are running in the 10K in your community, that's good too. All of us need to become, at some levels, a cancer researcher, but we also have to turn that interest into a kind of active advocacy on behalf of the fact that stuff won't happen unless there's stuff happening, and that happening doesn't happen unless there's funding. And it's so interesting, for someone who's been in American history, people have said, oh, this is such a departure. It's not. And Sid has written a book that has yet to be published on the human genome, which we've said yes to. I have had enough experience with the Mayo Clinic, the first hospital that always put the patient into the equation, something we're only now learning how to do, and I want to make a film on the Mayo. And so, there's lots of energy right now within the media community, as you'll hear all day, to do this. We just need to coordinate how this gets done, who our partners are, and how we go out and try to be the reconciling spirit for this dialectic that seems to just drag us down into this endless thing that presumes that the entity that wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, that liberated slaves and built the Transcontinental Railroad and the Land Grant College Act and the National Parks and child labor laws and Social Security and the GI Bill and an interstate highway system and put a man on the moon, is somehow a malevolent force that doesn't deserve to apply its extraordinary wealth to something as critical as a disease that has touched every person in this room.
You suggested that you use the metaphor that the body politic needs chemo, but I would suggest that it needs
radiation.
Targeted mutations.
Targeted mutations, yeah. That would be called voter activism.
Exactly. I think that almost everything involves voter activism. It seems to be, it will begin turning the tide against this bizarre anti-science movement.
But it isn't just that, it's what we need to do. We live in a media culture and we assume we're active players. We're actually passive receivers. And I think the reason why I've stayed in public television, I probably assume the reason why you stayed in public media, is that we actually get people to do stuff. We had 33 million people watch our national parks film in the fall of 2009, and then the next summer, a third of them got up and went to a park. Right?
That's amazing.
The attendance at Civil War battle sites went up 300, 400%, and sort of stayed there for 25 years. We know that the equation that we assume that we're passive doesn't necessarily work if you're doing it in that authentic way that we spoke about at the very, very beginning. So I think we have an opportunity with this to just not only activate interest, discussion, conversation, but the more important activation that comes with real action. And this is why we're here today, figuring out the kind of strategies that we'll employ. But I interrupted you, I didn't mean to. I just feel very passionate about how it's possible to have a media.
And your film.
Oh, it's all about me.
Yes. However, I have many things to say.
No, I mean, we need to activate that part that pushes people to real action. That's the most important.
Let me tell you something that I've heard in the interviews that I've done for our little part of this project, and that is there's a disconnect in the public mind between which cancers are most common and which are most covered and which are most actually, those things are all connected. Whatever is most covered is believed to be the most common and is also the most funded. And in an effort to pick this apart, they can't figure out which came first, the public or the funding, which spurred breakthroughs that were covered by the media, or the media coverage that did that. All we know is that it's this kind of perpetuating cycle. So you've got something like leukemia, which is believed in the public mind and also in the coverage and also in the funding to be the 4th most common cancer is actually the 10th. And the 6th most common cancer, which never even rates at all, is bladder cancer. And so then you have to figure out, how do we spend our money and why? Maybe it should be tied to incidence, because maybe that's not what really matters. People who get leukemia tend to be young. People who get bladder cancer tend to be old. Maybe if you do a cost-benefit analysis, you decide that the money should go to preserve younger people than older people. That's fine, if that's the way people decide, but that question is never asked. Instead, it's this sort of inchoate, unconscious, spotty awareness. You know, I was talking to one guy who had done this study about the public and the funding and the media versus the actual incidents, who somebody on the show laughed and said, he's a shill for bladder cancer. He kept bringing that up as the counter-example. You know, he said, on the local level, you know, let's say a $2 million grant to a researcher doing bladder research would therefore create a bladder researcher for life, whereas $2 million for breast cancer is kind of a drop in the bucket. Not that he said that any cancers aren't worthy. They're all worthy of tons more money. So changing that awareness, because the public has an impact of what gets funded at local institutions, that's a way to go. In terms of the media, he said that better training for science journalists, because if you're a science journalist, you're going to cover the breakthroughs.
If it leads, it leads.
Exactly. Well, you know, or if it's weird, it leads. You know, there's more coverage of nani juice than colon screening.
Yes.
So these science journalists are a crucial part of the mix. These medical journalists, and they need to be trained to understand that covering cancer isn't just about the press releases, because the press releases come from the breakthroughs and the innovative and often unsuccessful cancer experiments, right, which leads to what he calls cancer fatalism. Yes. Everything causes cancer, choose your carcinogen. You told us butter was bad, that margarine was good, then margarine was bad, and now the studies suggest that it's there's absolutely no difference between margarine and butter.
So the science might help us out of this too, and might provide us, because
if the voice gets out to say it clearly.
That's exactly right, and of course the medium is the message. But at the beginning we had a kind of naive sense of what cancer was. You know, we knew it was the uncontrolled growth of cells. And so we assume, therefore, in the modern history, the modern age, which begins with leukemia treatment, which begins with Sidney Farber, that if we could find a treatment for one cancer, we'd be finding a treatment for all. We quickly discovered that was not the case. But what's so interesting, almost as if science was the prodigal son or daughter, it has moved around. And we now realize that cancers we have become siloed, as I said before, in our specific, either fashionable or unfashionable sort of Siberia of research on a cancer that may be very prevalent, but isn't getting the kind of ink that it deserves. We're beginning to understand now, with the genetic dimensions, with immunotherapy, that we may be back to being able to lift everyone out of that silo and find that unified theory. And once you've done that, then we're not saying that there'll be a one-size-fit-all cure, but we will have
a one-size process, at least. We
will have a process that allows people to talk to one another, and that you begin to see there's serendipity you're talking about. I mean, you know, we said in the introduction of our film that sometimes success leads to stunning failure, and sometimes that stunning failure leads to unexpected success. And there's amazing moments when just the cross-pollination, somebody from infectious diseases is going to tell you that combination chemotherapy might be better than a single dose of amenopterin, which is what Sidney Farber's promoting. Sometimes it's someone else saying, you know what, I know this from my own personal experience that this drug treating this non-cancer issue is doing what we want to happen to this patient
that
right
arthritis drug.
You know, let's try to do it. So it's amazing, and I think, I hope, and I believe that the leading lights, and I think our film has the greatest collection of talking heads, the smartest collection of talking heads we've ever had in any film, are beginning to sense the notion of we're going to merge, and that kind of favoritism and the kind of superficiality in which we bestow the treatment, the juice, the prevention, the early detection, the drug that will work, and we'll now have a more ecumenical and balanced view of how we go forward. And that will only lead to many more cancers becoming, like so many cancers have so far, into the curable, or if not that, then certainly the treatable position that we want them to be in.
One of the most amazing things, let me just say, about your film, and Vince is indicating, was that, as you said, you drew a parallel with the Civil War, but it was as if you got those generals on tape. I mean, these heroes, these fanatics, these people who went from the light side to the dark side, you know, people who started out brilliant and then ended up obstructive, and just people whose breakthroughs went entirely against the tide and who risked everything. They're alive. They're in your documentary.
Which tells you what the story is. If you've got an Egyptian papyrus that says there is no treatment from 4,000 years ago, and the main part of our story begins in the late 40s, and some of those people are alive, that just tells you where the leaps and bounds we've been. And as much as we can look back on our film, I think records in agonizing details all these optimistic moments where it'll be cured by this time, and the doctors are saying this, and we've had to walk it back, and perhaps, undoubtedly, we will have to walk back a lot of the current optimism. Nonetheless, we are at a particular phase, and as Jose Baselga says in our film, who's the physician-in-chief at Sloan Kettering, you know, this is the moment. These next 2 decades will be the moment for cancer. But that presupposes many things. A kind of accurate, responsible media coverage. A kind of rigorous artistic communication of the stories of this. It requires the funding necessary, the coordination of that funding. So there's a lot of conditional elements having nothing to do with the pure science of it that are going to be brought to bear on whether this will be another false start or limited success or something that we can really translate and look back. And of course, everyone here has a dog in this fight.
Yeah. So this is the moment. That's the place to end.
Time to see the clip.
Oh, the clip.
In Philadelphia, at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Carl June has used genetic engineering to give the T cells in the immune system a kind of homing device.
We know the immune system can be around as a form of surveillance and cull out the early tumors. But in most cases, it fails, and it can't really distinguish at all between a tumor cell and normal cells.
The T cells can't see cancer cells. They are completely blind. They will wander right by. You can actually see this under the microscope. They don't recognize the cell as being bad. So we have to redirect that T cell We put in a new gene into the cell, and that new gene forces the T cell to see the cancer cell. So it's very much taking off the blindfold and allowing the T cell to see the cancer cell.
By re-engineering T cells this way, June is creating a living drug attuned to each patient's cancer. He received approval to try the technique in a clinical trial of seriously ill leukemia patients. At the same time, a 6-year-old girl named Emily Whitehead, who was being treated for leukemia in a nearby hospital, took a sudden turn for the worse.
Our doctor came in and said she has a full relapse. It's very different now, and you know, survival was less than 30%.
We found out that she does have a specific mutation, and the doctor told me not to Google it, not to look up any information on it. And so, of course, I did right away. And I saw that very few people with that specific mutation survive. I mean, very few.
Emily's health worsened by the day, and when the possibility of a bone marrow transplant fell through, the Whiteheads leapt at the chance to enroll their daughter in Dr. June's new trial.
You know, if anything was going to work, this was going to be it, because there wasn't anything else left for her. If it didn't work, we probably only had a few weeks left with her.
Flush it.
4 weeks after arriving at Children's Hospital, Emily's cells were ready. She would be the first child and only the 4th person ever to receive this treatment. And her doctor, Stephen Grupp, prepared to give her the first of 3 infusions.
Emily Whitehead, 5'5".
This is the stuff that we're actually talking about, and each day the volume goes up. We've only done this in a very small number of adult patients, but how actually well it will work in kids is only possible to know by actually doing it. All right, we're going to get started here.
Why is there 2?
You seeing 2 Rachels?
That's all right. Okay, we're done. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Day 2, we went in and got 30% then. First day was 10%. And we went home. She was on my back doing horsey back rides and felt good. And then at midnight, she spiked a fever. So we drove back to the ER. And then things just spun out of control. And they put her to sleep. You know, and then that was tough, you know, because at that point, Dr. Alexis said, this is as serious as it can get. And then they had a whole team, as soon as they had her under, a whole team of doctors come in. And I suited up with them and put the mask on and everything, and then, you know, watch them cut artery lines in both wrists and then in her thigh, and they cut an artery line in her neck. And when they were done, there was 17 IV pumps keeping her alive.
They came to us and said that they didn't think that she was going to make it through the night. I remember sitting by her bed watching watching her on the ventilator, and I just kept thinking that this can't be the end. This isn't how it's going to end. It can't be it.
She's as sick as a human being can possibly be. The ICU staff are working flat out to try to keep her alive. We obviously think this is a toxicity of the T cells, but we don't really know what's happening. And so now what?
With Emily's life slipping away, June's team frantically ran another batch of blood tests, hoping to uncover precisely why her new immune cells had turned on her and made her so sick. The tests came back showing skyrocketing levels of an immune protein called IL-6.
When those levels came back, they were literally off the charts. So then I suggested a drug that can block IL-6. That's never been given to cancer patients before, but it is an FDA-approved drug for juvenile arthritis. And it just happens that my daughter has that disease.
Dr. Grupp said, I'm going to tell you, we're grasping for straws, but if we give her this arthritis drug, it could help, because she can't get any sicker or she won't be with us.
There is an enormous role of luck and happenstance in these kind of situations. We gave that drug, and her response was astonishing. I mean, the ICU staff that were on that night say they have never seen a patient that sick get better that quickly.
Emily finally woke up in the intensive care unit on her 7th birthday. After her brush with death, the doctors still didn't know if the T-cell therapy was working. 3 weeks later, they did a bone marrow test. It came back negative. Emily's leukemia had vanished. Emily's close call had threatened the clinical trial, but in the end, dozens of other children with leukemia were treated, and the arthritis drug that saved Emily's life became a standard part of the therapy. Emily was through the worst, but she was entering uncharted territory. As the first child ever to get this treatment, her medical team had no idea how long her new immune cells would be able to keep her cancer at bay. In April 2014, 2 years after she received Carl June's risky gene therapy treatment for her cancer, Emily Whitehead returned to Children's Hospital in Philadelphia for a checkup.
Let's whip this stuff quick. Well, today is Emily's 2 years since treatment. So, you know, we're going to get our blood work checked, and so it's a big day for us.
We're always a little bit nervous because just walking into the hospital and you hear the sounds that we heard for 3 months. There's that big structure and there's like a dinging, and all of a sudden, you know, it'll hit us all over again.
There's been too many times when we didn't get the right outcome, so it does make us nervous, but we don't expect anything but good results today. How about it, Em? What do you think?
So, how you feeling?
Good.
Any problems?
No.
None whatsoever?
No.
You go to school every day?
Yes.
You listen to your teachers?
Yes.
Okay. How are your grades?
Good.
When we wrote this trial, we said we would follow patients for 2 years. We never imagined that we would actually be able to follow patients for 2 years, but we said that's what we would do. And now we've reached that point. Nice deep breath, son. We'll continue to monitor her situation. We'll continue to watch for the possibility of her disease coming back. But she has completed the treatment. The question you're really asking me is how long do you need the cells to stay in remission forever? And the answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, we're super excited that she's at this point.
We are
but,
too. Yeah.
You know, every day that she goes out from her cell therapy makes her unique. So the amazing thing is that she's doing as well as she's doing. The nerve-wracking thing is we don't really have the answers on what's going to the next year or 2 years or 10 years look like.
Yeah.
We don't know. because she is plowing new ground here. You know, nobody thought we would be in this position when we started.
I have a dog, a bunny, and a fish.
Oh my gosh, you love animals, don't you?
She is absolutely a pioneer. I mean, she was the first kid. She was the first patient with ALL. She was the first patient who got so terribly ill. She taught us about the toxicity control treatment, which has saved this therapy.
All right, so let me set this up real quick. Turn on the light.
We've now treated 30 children and had, 27 of them have complete responses. I mean, they're not lasting in all of them, but it looks very hopeful that there's going to be many more children like Emily. We can't say the C word, cure, yet. We don't know. It's only with more time will we know if every last cancer cell's gone.
We got some results back, and CBC looks good. White count's 4.5, hemoglobin's 12.9, and her platelets are 171, and the differential's okay. So the preliminary look is 2 years cancer-free. So
It's a good day.
it's a great day.
One thing that I really thought about when I read Sir Arthur's book and when I saw Ken's film is how separated we are from death in our most modern iterations. Like people used to keep their bodies in the parlor, and you knew that death was part of life. I think part of the problem with cancer is that it became synonymous with death, and we're starting to separate it. It still can kill you. I think still 50% of people who get it succumb to it in the end. So it's real, and it's present. And even there, we heard 30 kids, 27 responded to treatment, 3 did not. And I was just thinking of how do you process death? How do you live with death? How do you contend with it? How do you accept it? And I was thinking of what Ken went through with his mom all those years ago, and well, I'm just going to throw it to you. What happened yesterday?
Yeah, well, updates this morning. I living without a mother for 50 years, as it will be this April 28th, is a long, long time. And so I've been adopted periodically. The longest serving mother, after my real mother, died this morning at 6 a.m. And I've been with her for the last 4 days. We did not call 911. We did not call the health department. We did not call the funeral home. I will leave here. I had planned to spend the day with you, but I would leave here to go back to a body that's there. Something incredibly terrifying to every one of us, legitimately so, is something incredibly human and real and very much a part of life and actually gives meaning. There's something extraordinarily grounding about what the handful of us who have collected around my dear French mother, Marielle, who's up right now lying in an apartment on East 69th Street and will be for hours to come.
And the first step is simply being brave.
Being present. I have on my phone her folded arms in repose, hands in repose. And when I told my daughter Lily, my second daughter, she's 28 right now, that this month I will have been without my mother for 50 years, which is way too long to be without a mother. She said, "No, Dad, 11 years is too short to be with a mother." This is the same daughter who was, and I think the final kind of lesson for me, the takeaway, this is the same daughter who was, at 1.5 years, 2 years, 2.5 years old, absolutely terrified of the vacuum cleaner as a little girl. I mean, traumatically terrorized by it, and had to be out of the house, certainly in a different room, perhaps asleep, for us to get the vacuuming done. And one day, she poised at the door and walked over to the middle of the room where the monster was roaring and sat down on it. 2.5 years old, sat down on it. And in our family, since that moment, we've talked about the inevitable requirement of a life engaged and well-lived is sitting on the vacuum cleaner. That's what we say in our families. you need to sit on the vet. You need to move toward, Eleanor Roosevelt said this, you had to wake up every day and move towards the thing that gave you fear. And that I think that too often, because the euphemism of cancer has been, as you so correctly described it, that we haven't just metaphorically put Aunt so-and-so in the attic. We literally did that. That within the last 60, 70 years, that it's sort of time to actually sort of strip away the rather superficial fears that we have, that sort of anxieties that actually comfort us in a short term, but don't in any way prepare us for this fact of human life. None of us will get out of this alive. This is why we tell stories, why we make art, why we're scientists. When you think we could just be curled up in a ball in the fetal position, and we have not done that. But we do a lot of interpositions that make it harder for us to live lives in relationship to the inevitability of what will happen to everyone here. I was saying, I think, to Elizabeth earlier that I was told by a therapist that the sign of maturity is that, of real adulthood, is that you don't believe that an exception will be made in your case and you will live forever. And yet, we still maintain several rooms in this complicated structure for exactly that possibility. And while I will certainly not invite you to East 69th Street, I will go to be reminded that this woman, this joyful, intelligent woman who lived to 94, who loved me unconditionally and I loved her, is physically kind of there, getting cold, but also not there, but lives in the example of her life. And so, you know, we need to all sit on the vacuum cleaner in whatever way. That means whatever's uncomfortable. I've yet to go to a lay audience and find anyone who knows why it's called cancer.
Really?
No, not a single audience. I've traveled
Everyone here
around
knows.
the country. I think everyone else understands. You saw the movie, right? Which may be the fundamental reason why we need public media. Is that we take this thing that we don't even want to know. You know why heart disease happens, you know why this, but the Greeks thought when they could see a tumor aggressively that it was like this crab that was omnivorously sneaking up and grabbing the stuff, and they called it karkinos, the Greek word for crab. And we have carcinogenic that comes from the Greek word, as so many of our medical things are. But when the Latin world overspread the Greek one, we took the Latin word for crab, which is cancer. And that's a very simple thing. It didn't hurt a bit. You don't catch it by watching the film. You know, it's sort of time to sit on the vacuum cleaner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.